proper discussion of primacy and synodality involves many aspects, such as the parish, the role of the laity, and the involvement of the entire church, not only that of bishops. But since the documents that are the focus of our gathering are concerned primarily with episcopal synodality, allow me to briefly speak about regional synodality in Orthodoxy, and then move on to universal synodality, especially regarding the relationship between Catholic and Orthodox churches. So first, regional synodality. In Orthodoxy, episcopal synodality is most efficient at the level of autocephalous churches because it is sustained by primacy. At ecumenical encounters, the Orthodox have insisted on primacy as primus inter pares, which means first among equals, emphasizing the equality of all bishops and being hesitant to recognize more than a primacy of honor that is rather devoid of authority. Internally, however, the Orthodox are not hesitant about primacy. Primates of national churches have a significant degree of authority, as we shall see momentarily. Autocephalous churches have developed various models of synodality. For example, the Patriarchate of Constantinople gathers the Synodos Endemusa, the permanent or the standing synod, which was initially composed of bishops living closer to the imperial capital. Today, bishops from Constantinople's territories around the world, by rotation, participate at monthly meetings of the Synodos Endemusa to discuss regular issues and to respond in a timely fashion to emergencies. The structure in various forms has been in place at least from the 4th century. Other Orthodox churches, such as the Moscow Patriarchate, follow similar models. On the one hand, this practice of permanent synods represents a major sign of Orthodoxy's commitment to synodality, communal decision-making, and avoiding authoritarian temptations in the church. On the other hand, when a permanent synod decides in matters that apply to the entire autocephalous churches, not all bishops from that territory have decided in matters that affect their dioceses. In other words, the Synodos Endemusa is a structure that stands above the local diocese. In the diocesan bishop does not always participate in the decision-making process that affects his diocese. Ideally, all bishops would be equal, able to decide in their own jurisdictions in all local matters. For example, a local bishop should not need the approval of the archbishop for ordaining priests within his diocese. Moreover, each bishop should have a clearly delineated territory. Instead, in Western Orthodoxy, there are overlapping jurisdictions, this also being the case in some traditionally Orthodox countries, such as Ukraine or Moldova. Another instance where jurisdictions are not clearly delineated is that of auxiliary bishops. Theoretically, an auxiliary bishop has a title different than that of the archbishop of that region, but in fact, their territories coincide and the auxiliary bishop serves under the archbishop. Equally problematic is the custom to ordain bishops for defunct sees, since in practice they become titular bishops without a flock. Auxiliary and titular bishops, however, are more than the exception than they are the rule, and so synods are mostly composed of bishops with real jurisdictions and real flocks. The synodal structure of Orthodoxy is particularly evident when several bishops concelebrate the divine liturgy in the order of processions and commemorations based on their canonical order. When the primate visits another diocese, he is the leader of the Eucharistic service, even when the local bishop, who is the head of that specific local church, is present. In other words, the synodal order takes precedence over the principles of Eucharistic ecclesiology. And yet, visiting bishops, including the primate, can only visit a diocese at the invitation of the local bishop, and thus the local bishop remains responsible for all aspects of ecclesial life in his diocese in accordance with Eucharistic ecclesiology. Synodality is also manifested in the exchange of letters, mutual material assistance, collaboration on pastoral issues, and in the ancient tradition that ordinations of bishops must involve 3, or in special circumstances, 2 neighboring bishops. Now, after these brief remarks about regional synodality, let's talk about universal synodality today. Again, synodality is strongest at parish, diocese, and regional levels, but not at the level of the universal church. In the past, ecumenical councils or even councils with worldwide representations that were not accepted as ecumenical were part and parcel of the experience of the church. If the ecumenical council gathers representatives of all local churches, more or less historically speaking, and if its decisions are to be accepted by the entire church, in the present context of schism, it is practically impossible to convene an ecumenical council. The World Council of Churches does not claim to be such a council, although its assemblies come the closest to an ecumenical council in a disunited church. Hence, denominations can experience universal synodality only internally in separation from other denominations. For example, the Catholic Church regularly convenes synods of bishops with worldwide representation, a practice established by Pope Paul VI in 1965, subsequently observed consistently, although with various degrees of success. These synods recommend to the Pope their findings, which become authoritative teaching only if the Pope ratifies them by virtue of his universal jurisdiction within the Catholic Church, an authority that the Synod of Bishops does not have. For example, after the 2014-15 synods, the theology of the family that emerged from these councils became the basis for Pope Francis's 2016 apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia, or the joy of love. In the case of today's Orthodox Church, a pan-Orthodox council comes closest to universal synodality, but it is merely a remote possibility. The 2016 Great and Holy Council of Crete should have been an impetus for universal synodality, but the opposite happened when 4 of the 14 national churches withdrew shortly before the council. The Orthodox Church needs guidance on pastoral issues such as living a richer ecumenical life at the local level, interfaith marriages, rules of fastings, and so on. But it seems that pan-Orthodox synodality is paralyzed by internal political conflicts and by fear of the segment of Orthodoxy that opposes ecumenism, openness to society, and progress. Concerning the latter, perhaps now is the time to postpone the attempts to appease them and focus instead on Orthodoxy's immediate needs that have for too long remained unfulfilled. The inability to gather in a pan-Orthodox council despite almost a century of preparations, though in full force since 1961, moderated Orthodox claims that synodality is its ecumenical charism, or even that it exists at all at universal level. Despite the long-standing Eastern tradition of synodality and the caricaturist accusations that Catholics are authoritarians led by an infallible pope that renders conciliarity unnecessary, the Second Vatican Council remains the highest standard of synodality within any given denomination in recent times. Crete also radically challenged the Orthodox vision of Christian unity. Orthodox representatives to ecumenical dialogues regularly claim that the ideal model of unity requires that bishops gather in the same synod and receive communion together. This ideal of unity is often imposed as a condition for Orthodox Catholic unity, when in fact it cannot be put into practice in worldwide Orthodoxy. Throughout history, inter-Orthodox unity endured even when local churches refused to participate in the same synod, including Crete. Moreover, Eucharistic community with a particular bishop does not represent the criterion for belonging to the Orthodox family. Occasionally, hierarchs of different churches interrupt Eucharistic communion with each other. Sometimes this interruption of communion goes even further to apply to the faithful as well, as it happened in 2018 between the Patriarchates of Moscow and Constantinople over Ukrainian autocephaly, when the former interrupted commemorations and Eucharistic communion with the latter, although Constantinople did not reciprocate the gesture. Shortly thereafter, 3 other autocephalous Orthodox churches recognized Ukrainian autocephaly, so the Moscow Patriarchate ceased Eucharistic communion with the bishops and the faithful of the Church of Greece, with the exception of 7 bishops and the faithful of their diocese, as well as the Patriarchate of Alexandria and all Africa, while the Eucharistic schism with Cyprus extends only to the level of primates. And yet, in a deep sense, Orthodoxy remains one. Could this development help the cause of Christian unity? Will Orthodoxy continue to require Eucharistic and synodal communion as conditions for unity with the Catholic Church? Or will it consider the similarities between the 2 schisms, East and West, Moscow and Constantinople, and reassess both the gravity of the issue separating the 2 churches and the motives for continuing the schism? After these questions, let's talk about primacy, East and West. The main purpose of this section is to see how an Orthodox theologian shows primacy in the West, and then to speak about primacy in the East at the universal level. And I'll start with a personal story. The first time I visited the Vatican in 2012, I attended the Roman Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. Prominent in front of us was Cathedra Petri, or the chair of St. Peter, masterfully sculpted by Bernini. I was mesmerized by the beauty of the artwork, although as a theologian, I chuckled when I saw above the chair a dove representing the inspiration or the Holy Spirit resting upon the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, as the dove rested upon Jesus' baptism. I also noted the 4 doctors of the church, Saints Ambrose, Athanasius, John Chrysostom, and Augustine, 2 from the east and 2 from the west, all in accord with the teaching proclaimed by the one who sits on St. Peter's chair. The sight of the keys gave me another chuckle, thinking how Jesus's promise to give Peter the power of the keys to bind and loose is in fact a post-resurrection appearance to Peter that was interposed back into the life of the historical Jesus, and how binding and loosing was understood during Second Temple Judaism as the teacher's authority to say what is permissible and what is not among his disciples, a different situation compared to the 3-tiered papal tiara that Bernini placed between the keys to symbolize the Pope's authority. As you can tell, I was a bit skeptical at that time, right? But soon, the skeptical Eastern theologian noticed that the people who were gathering for the Mass spoke all the languages of the earth, and yet they all converged into one point. Then their diverse voices became one as they sang the same melody in the same language of the Mass. I'm not in favor of living people worshiping in dead languages, but Latin was the only language that we all shared, and that is what united us at that moment. After the Mass, the multitudes gathered in St. Peter's Square outside the Basilica. The square itself, conceived by the same Bernini, gathers pilgrims from all over the world in an embrace that brings them into one place. It was a Sunday when the Pope addressed the people that were gathered in the square, thousands or perhaps tens of thousands. Why did all these people listen to him and were so joyous to see him? Because he was their father, Papa. This endearing term reflects the essence of Catholic identity. The Pope is their father. True, there are priests in parishes, bishops in dioceses, episcopal conferences, but transcending them all is the father of more than 1.2 billion Catholics all over the world, namely the Pope, Il Papa, and he is their bishop, I understood at that moment. Before this experience, I had, of course, studied the papacy in Orthodox institutions. I received a PhD from a Catholic institution, and I had taught for several years at another Catholic university where I am now at Duquesne. 4 years later, I lived in Rome for 3 months, this time under a different Pope, Pope Francis. I saw how he too gathered tens of thousands of faithful eager to hear him or to participate in the Paschal liturgy as he celebrated in St. Peter's Square. These experiences solidified my understanding of the papacy as one of the, if not the, most important elements of Catholic identity. This is a positive experience of the Pope. Faithful from all around the world surround him in one place. He enables them to transcend their theological differences as secondary to their Catholic identity. He motivates them to surpass political divisions and embrace a common cause, as for example, the environment, a divisive theme within the United States. And he has the authority to convene all bishops as a synod, despite their centrifugal tendencies. All these elements of papal primacy are aspects of a ministry of unity that is much needed in Christianity today, especially in Orthodoxy. These experiential considerations about the Pope's ministry in unity are not without practical shortcomings. For example, a Pope's calling to become the mouthpiece of the Catholic Church cannot be overemphasized to the detriment of particularity of context and of diversity of opinions. A maximalist exercise of Petrine mystery results in uniformization of a church that counts, again, over 1.2 billion faithful around the globe and countless more throughout history. Unfortunately, also, to speak realistically, there have been throughout history papal abuses. And so the skepticism of Orthodox Protestant or even many Catholics regarding papal authority is warranted. In the case of the first two, schism was the only option so that the Pope would have no authority over them. And that is why ecumenical discussions are progressing so slowly on this subject. We need to protect ourselves from the worst case scenario. But this defensive attitude does not resonate with most faithful living in the West. Orthodox faithful immigrating to the Western world when they first formed their communities, used Catholic churches as gathering places, often without paying any rent. Their neighbors and best friends are Catholic, and their children go to Catholic schools. The West, for these Orthodox faithful, is the friendly neighbor, indeed the sister and brother in Christ, and not a pope remote somewhere in the annals of history. Even the recent popes have enjoyed much popularity around the world, and thus the ecumenical dialogue on the role of the papacy, still preparing for the worst-case scenario based on negative historical memory, remains gravely incongruent with the experience of today's faithful who thirst for unity. Not all history is negative, of course. The book of Acts, which documents the expansion of the church from Jerusalem to the nations, ends with the hopeful image of Paul the apostle in Rome, proclaiming the kingdom of God and the teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. This is Acts 28. That is also where he entered the heavenly kingdom after being martyred, as was St. Peter. Being the place of martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul, Rome gained a prestige among Christians that far surpassed the fame that the imperial capital already enjoyed. The tradition of martyrdom continued, and to this day, pilgrims can visit catacombs that used to house large numbers of Roman bishops who gave their life for the faith. As early as Ignatius of Antioch's time, Rome was known as the one that, quote, presides in love. Rome's ministry of presiding in love took many forms throughout the centuries and in different parts of the world. The saying attributed to Augustine when Rome had spoken, the issue is concluded, Roma locuta causa finita, was an exaggeration throughout most of history. And yet Rome had the privilege of receiving appeals from bishops who had been deposed by their provincial synods. The Pope would initially order a new trial, and if necessary, only then would give a pronouncement. Besides disciplinary issues, the Bishop of Rome also heard appeals pertaining to dogmatic issues. Eastern saints such as John Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, and Theodore the Studite have appealed to the Pope. Most notably, Maximus the Confessor found protection at the, quote, most holy church of the Romans, the Sun of eternal light, which he considered as first among all churches having been entrusted with the power to bind and loose. Maximus's rhetoric regarding the papacy, and he is one among many, makes even today's ecumenically minded Easterners blush. But it is an undisputable historical fact that most Roman bishops in the age of the councils were regarded as preeminent defenders of apostolic tradition. While all heresies condemned by the ecumenical councils around in the East, being embraced by patriarchs of Constantinople and emperors, all popes, with the exception of Honorius, remained firm in the true faith. At the Council of Chalcedon 451, the conciliar fathers proclaimed that, quote, Peter had spoken through Leo. Of course, Leo's place as the successor of Peter was not enough in and of itself. Leo had to be in accord with the true faith confessed by Cyril of Alexandria. And, quote, piously and truly did Leo teach, so taught Cyril, end quote. The Pope's venerable place among teaching authorities did not automatically translate into jurisdictional authority. By the time of Nicaea I in 325, it did not extend beyond the Roman province. It took almost a millennium for the papal authority to extend over the western half of the empire. Throughout all these centuries, the Pope never had the authority to appoint bishops in the territories of another ancient patriarchate. His interventions in the East were of a different nature, usually as an arbiter in disputes. Thus, while the Church enjoyed relative unity in the first millennium, the Bishop of Rome exercised two different types of authority, a type of primacy that involved full authority in the West, and a limited type of primacy that heard appeals and proclaimed the true doctrine in the East. One of the greatest tragedies of the schism between East and West is that, once separated from the East, the second type of primacy disappeared, and all that was left was a full patriarchal type of authority that the Pope exercised wherever he could manifest his influence. For example, as a result of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, he replaced Eastern bishops with Latin ones, thus manifesting a patriarchal type of authority in the East, an authority that only was beginning to expand. As John Quinn explains, and I quote, with the discovery of the New World in the 15th century and the missionary expansion of the Latin Catholic Church in the 16th century and later, The patriarchal kind of papal government was gradually extended over the whole worldwide Catholic Church, bringing with it uniformity of liturgical language and practice, the choice of appointment of all bishops by the Pope, and the appointment of papal delegates in all countries where the Catholic Church had been planted, end quote. Queen's last remark is quite important for a proper understanding of the development of the papacy, especially the expansion of its religious and secular primacy. Since Emperor Constantine moved the imperial capital and the Roman emperor resided in Constantinople beginning with 330, the Eastern patriarchs had their secular authority limited by the emperor and their religious authority by the other patriarchs. In the West, however, the situation was very different. There were no other apostolic sees besides Rome, so the Pope's religious authority was only nominally limited by other bishops. And since the emperor resided in the East, the Pope enjoyed an unusual amount of secular authority exercised to the exasperation of Western princes. With the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day in 800 as the Emperor of the Romans at the hands of Pope Leo III in Rome, the papacy took full control over who holds the secular power in the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, the papacy gradually developed to have unchallenged power, secular and religious, in the West and throughout the world through Catholic missions. Such a view of primacy became unacceptable to the East. While rejecting this time of Western primacy, the East continued to consider primacy as an essential condition of synodality. During the existence of the Byzantine Empire, that place was naturally assigned to the Bishop of Constantinople in the East. After the move of the imperial capital from Rome to Constantinople in 330, the first major occasion to exalt the place of the new Roman ecclesial order was the Second Ecumenical Council that took place, unsurprisingly, in Constantinople in 381. Its third canon justified the change on political grounds, and I quote, "The Bishop of Constantinople has the prerogatives of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because this city is the new Rome," end quote. The Bishop of Alexandria, and especially Rome, did not accept this decision, even while receiving the doctrinal proclamations of the council. Decades later, Canon 28 of the Fourth Ecumenical Council in Chalcedon, 451, elevated Constantinople to be equal to Rome, again justified by the presence of political authorities in the city, even though Constantinople remained second in rank to Rome. The Bishop of Constantinople was given the authority to ordain metropolitans and bishops for Pontus, Asia, and Thrace, and the barbarian regions, an authority that Constantinople later invoked to claim jurisdiction over the diaspora. The delegates of Pope Leo registered their protest in the Acts of the Council, and the Pope himself rejected this canon. The competition between the Old Rome and the New Rome was in full swing. The tension intensified in the 6th century when Patriarch John the Faster of Constantinople adopted the title ecumenical, meaning that his authority extends over the entire civilized world, the ecumene. What exactly that meant remains debatable, since the Patriarch did not claim to have direct jurisdiction over the entire world. The Patriarch's action was probably more a sign of weakness than a strength, since he would not have had to claim the title ecumenical if his authority were undisputed. Also telling was Rome's reaction, which came from a position of strength. In response to the Patriarch of Constantinople's new title, Pope St. Gregory I the Great adopted the title Servant of the Servants of God, Servus Servorum Dei, the title that subsequent popes have retained as well. Despite these 6th century quarrels, the exact opposite happened in the ensuing centuries. Rome claimed universal jurisdiction, while Constantinople claimed a greater degree of primacy in the East. As Edward Szyczenski shows, in the years immediately preceding the schisms, the popes claim to an expanded authority, and the ecumenical patriarch's strengthened position, given the backing of the Byzantine emperor, did not exclude one another. There was even an Eastern proposal to recognize universal primacy as long as Constantinople was according first autonomy and second primacy in the East. Szyczenski details the following proposals, which still has potential to bring East and West together, and I quote, "In 1024, Emperor Basil II and Patriarch Eustathius of Constantinople sent Pope John XIX a formula that they hoped would clarify the respective positions of Rome and Constantinople. They suggested that the Church of Constantinople might be called and regarded as universal within its own sphere, in suo orbe, just as Rome is throughout the world, in universo. On one level, this formula was a gift to Rome, as it was prepared to recognize the supreme power of the Roman See over the whole church and even Constantinople, reissuing the ordinances of Justinian II, the Phocas, and of Justinian I. True, there was also the suggestion that administratively, Constantinople should be admitted to be self-sufficient and autonomous, but given the relative impotence of the papacy at the time, this was not an unreasonable request. Unfortunately, despite being initially inclined to accept this proposal, Pope John XIX's confidence persuaded him to reject it. But the proposal remains significant. It puts forth a possible solution to the schism between East and West, which clarifies that Rome's primacy in the East is not an absolute one, but guarantees Constantinople's autonomy and, by extension, the autonomy of all other Orthodox churches. It is tempting to look only at history for solutions to the current impasse. This is the approach of the current ecumenical discussions about primacy. Extremely influential in this sense was the so-called Ratzinger formula. In a lecture at Graz in 1976, long before being elected Pope Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger affirmed that, as to the doctrine of primacy, and this is a quote, Rome cannot claim more from the East than was formulated and practiced in the first millennium, end quote. In response, Krzyzewski cautions against attempting to extract a single model of papal authority in the first millennium. If anything, the first millennium suggests that the way forward is to accept that there are different ways in which papal authority can be exercised. Moreover, one should not take out of context the theological statements that some Eastern fathers have made either in favor or against papal primacy. These patristic passages can be easily distorted when does not consider whether the Pope was regarded as an ally or as an opponent in specific theological controversies. Eastern fathers grant the Pope a special teaching authority, but never place him above the rest of the Church. At the same time, what should not overstate their case for an so-called anti-Roman effect, as if early Christianity refused to recognize Rome any special authority. One can draw from history the conclusion that Roman primacy is compatible with the Eastern tradition of synodality based on the autonomy of the local churches. As a matter of fact, in a future united church, Orthodox theologians are ready to ascribe to Rome a position of primacy, but not the kind of primacy that Rome now has in the Catholic Church. The Orthodox should graciously acknowledge that Vatican I rushed to give the Pope more power than was necessary. The Council's Constitution, Pastor Aeternus, states that the Pope does not merely have a jurisdiction of honor, instead, he has episcopal authority, ordinary and immediate universal jurisdiction, meaning that the authority of the Pope does not come from the councils or from a church. To quote the first chapter of Pastor Aeternus, therefore, if anyone says that Blessed Peter the Apostle was not appointed by Christ the Lord as priest of all the apostles and visible head of the whole church militant, or that it was a primacy of honor only, and not one of true and proper jurisdiction that he directly and immediately received from our Lord Jesus Christ himself, let him be anathema. Chapter 3 states, if anyone says that the Roman pontiff has merely an office of supervision and guidance, and not the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the whole church, and this not only in matters of faith and morals, but also in those which concern the discipline and government of the church dispersed throughout the whole world, or that he has only the principal part, but not the absolute fullness of his supreme power, or that his power of that this power of his is not ordinary and immediate, but over all and each of the churches and over all and each of the pastor and faithful, let him be anathema. End quote. In fairness, the council's decision was motivated by conciliarism, which advocated for the subordination of the Pope's authority to that of the council, Gallicanism, French secular powers usurping the Pope's authority over French bishops, and ultramontane counter-reactions, that is, the exaggerated appeal to the Pope by bishops who sought approval for all matters over the mountains from Rome. Vatican I was also abruptly interrupted by the Franco-Prussian War, and so its work had to be continued decades later at Vatican II, which attempted to place the papacy in the context of the entire episcopate and the entire church. But if Orthodox theologians adopt such an understanding attitude, Catholic theologians also admit that the teaching of their church on the papacy remains controversial even after the Second Vatican Council. For example, Lumen Gentium 22 states that, quote, the Roman pontiff, by reason of his office of vicar of Christ, namely, as pastor of the entire church, has full, supreme, and universal power over the whole church, a power which he can always exercise unhindered, end quote. Vatican II conditions the synodality of the bishops upon the Pope, but papal authority does not depend on the bishops, even though it does not exclude the possibility that the Pope would collaborate with the other primates. Such a view of primacy is insufficient from an Orthodox perspective. Again, papal primacy and Eastern ecclesiology are not incompatible. Jose Ziulas acknowledges repeatedly that in a unified church, the Bishop of Rome would enjoy a sort of universal primacy that would be neither primacy of jurisdiction nor the prerogative of an individual, but the primacy of the local Church of Rome exercised in a synodal context. Zizioulas expects that the Pope will act communally together with the other bishops, respecting the fullness of the local church. At the same time, the Pope would have a moral and canonical authority that would enable him to convene councils and to express the common voice of the church as the mouthpiece of the entire church and of the consensus of bishops with whom he is sacramentally equal. And yet, in all these discussions on the authority of the Pope, it is important to remember that authority does not reside in his person as an individual, but as the representative of his local church that has primacy among other churches. Byzantine Catholic churches provide another model of unity that accounts for a different exercise of papal primacy in the West and in the East. The 1995 Synod of the Greek Catholic Church in Lebanon approved nearly unanimously the following confession of faith, and I quote, "Believe everything which the Orthodox Church teaching, and I am in communion with the Bishop of Rome in the role that the Eastern Fathers accorded him before the separation," end quote. With the agreement of Patriarch Ignatius IV Hazim, Antiochian Orthodox Metropolitan George Coder responded, and I quote, "I consider this profession of faith to set the necessary and sufficient conditions for reestablishing the unity of the Orthodox churches with Rome," end quote. Similarly, Kallistos Ware acknowledges that the Orthodox are quick to point to the invalidity of papal claims, but they find it rather difficult to speak positively about the role the Pope should have in a united church. And when they do, they come rather close to the model of Byzantine Catholic churches, said Kallistos Ware. This is not to say that the model of Eastern Catholic churches should be adopted wholesale. On the one hand, the genesis of these churches that were asked to recognize papal primacy but were promised that nothing else would change in their tradition, perhaps inadvertently, showed the recognition of papal primacy as the sufficient condition for unity. Rome did not regard filioque, purgatory, azyms, and clerical celibacy as church-dividing issues that Easterners had to accept as preconditions for unity. Papal authority stood alone in this category, even while missionaries and apologists fervently defended the remaining issues against the Orthodox. In practice, however, the recognition of papal primacy was followed by a systematic process of Latinization, historically speaking. Examples of Latinizations throughout centuries include the insertion of the filioque in liturgical books, Roman missionaries trying to introduce the use of unleavened bread, and the obstruction of married priesthood in the West. The efforts of some popes to impede Latinization, and they have to be given due credit, did not put at ease the minds of Easterners who continued to distrust that Rome would use its authority without abusing it. And yet, Byzantine Catholic churches have their own code of canon law, their own practices, and a great degree of autonomy, which are elements that should inspire future discussions of Christian unity. I will admit that the discussion of the role of Pope in a future united church has slipped into the realms of theological speculation and idealistic musings, so let us return to an experiential approach to primacy in the East. At a very superficial level, Orthodoxy has the solution to the tension between primacy and synodality. The Patriarch of Constantinople is primus inter pares, first among equals. Unfortunately, its practical application is far from providing an Eastern model of primacy that would have enough authority to make synodality possible at universal level, while ensuring that no bishop stands above the others. Constantinople certainly went too far with its claim of primacy in the past. For example, in what may sound both comical and aggravating today, In the 14th century, Patriarch Philotheos of Constantinople wrote to the princes of Russia, and I quote, "Since God has appointed our humility as leader of all Christians found anywhere on the inhabited earth, as solicitor and guardian of their souls, all of them depend on me, the father and teacher of them all." End quote. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, other Orthodox leaders would make similar claims under the assumption that Christianity cannot endure without a Rome, meaning a bishop who has primacy over all the rest. Since the first Rome fell to the Goths and was now Catholic, and the second Rome fell first under the West during the Fourth Crusade and then under the Ottomans, who would take the role of the third Rome? In the early 13th century, an independent Bulgarian patriarchate was established in the capital city of Turnovo, which began being called the Third Rome. Later on, in the same 13th century, after the Mongols sacked Kiev, the city of Novgorod replaced Kiev as the Orthodox capital of Rus Orthodoxy and borrowed from Turnovo the same title of Third Rome. The next center of Rus Orthodoxy, namely Moscow, gradually made the claim of being the Third Rome. The Tsars treated it with caution as they feared that it gave the church too much power. But the clergy and the people used it relentlessly, culminating with the letter of monk Philoftei from the monastery of Tsikov to Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow in the mid-1520s. In it, Philoftei reminds the prince that the first Rome fell away into heresy, by which he meant the Filioque, which he clumsily related to Apollorianism, while the second Rome was overtaken by the unbelieving Ottomans. The Tsar's destiny was to preside, quote, "in the new Third Rome, your mighty Tsarnosvo, or empire, to shine like the sun throughout the whole universe and to endure as long as the world endures. You are the only Tsar for Christians in the whole world. Two Romes have fallen and the third stands. A fourth will not be." End quote. Despite such enthusiastic statements, the Third Rome theory did not enjoy wide influence in the Muscovite monarchy. It came back to prominence only with the rise of Slavophilitism in the 19th century. The long suffering of the Russian Patriarchate under communism certainly challenged any dream of worldwide primacy. That is not to say that the communist authorities did not use the Patriarchate's standing in the Orthodox world to expand its own influence outside of the Soviet Union, but the secular authorities' intention was certainly not to bolster the position of the Patriarchate for religious reasons. It was primarily a means to counteract a Western-leaning Patriarchate of Constantinople. It is perhaps both surprising and sad to see that, after the fall of communism, the Moscow Patriarchate challenged Constantinople's standing with new vigor. Moscow regards itself as the gel that holds together the Ruski Mir, a presumed Russian world that includes many ex-Soviet territories that are no longer under Russian dominance politically, but are under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. The Patriarchate also expands its territory by establishing its own structures all over the world more than any other Patriarchate, acting as if it has universal primacy of jurisdiction. In contrast to these exaggerated claims of Eastern primacy stands the equally exaggerated claims of absolute equality among bishops. It is true that all bishops are equal from a sacramental point of view, regardless of administrative rank. It is also true that one of the merits of Afanasiev's Eucharistic ecclesiology was to emphasize the Catholicity of the Episcopal Church and not of the national autocephalous church, a unit that is, to quote him, half political and half ecclesial. To this latter alone, modern Orthodoxy ascribes the ability to be free and autonomous. Orthodox theology indeed rejects the idea of primacy on the universal scale, but it recognizes a partial primacy at the center of every autocephalous church, a primacy belonging to the head of that church. End quote. We need to embrace both the sacramental equality of all bishops and the reality that liturgical celebrations, administrative bodies, and synods require a primate with the real authority. In this realistic vein, none of the national Orthodox churches functions without a primate who has real authority. As Isioulas writes, it would be a mistake to regard the authority of, let us say, a patriarch in relation to a synod in the Orthodox Church as simply a primacy of honor, as it is often stated by Orthodox theologians. There is certainly more to this primacy than simple honor. The Patriarch can convoke a synod and set its agenda. His presence is a sine qua non condition for all canonical deliberations, such as the election of bishops. This means that the synod cannot function without its head, end quote. The authority of the primate within a national church thus includes calling the council, setting its agenda, ensuring the participation of the bishops in the council, and speaking on behalf of the council once a decision is made, a decision that the synod supports publicly. Moreover, the primate represents the national church in its relation with secular authorities and other churches. This practical situation reveals primacy as an ecclesiological concept that extends the authority of the primate beyond his immediate jurisdiction, but only as commonly agreed within episcopal synodality and not in a way that supersedes the authority of the local bishop in his own diocese in pastoral matters. One might wrongly assume that if all Orthodox churches agree with the concept of real primacy within their own borders, then automatically they all agree with the same concept of real primacy at pan-Orthodox level and in a united church at universal level. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Many ills stem from Orthodoxy's refusal to have a pan-Orthodox primate with the same authority that primates have within their own national churches. The most common way to refer to the authority of the ecumenical patriarch at pan-Orthodox level is that of primacy of honor, as designated by the Second Ecumenical Council. To clarify this terminology, the word primacy referred to the custom and use already recognized by the First Ecumenical Councils as ancient practice, whereby the bishops of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch, and later Jerusalem and Constantinople, exercised the personal ministry of oversight over an area much wider than that of their individual ecclesiastical provinces. According to Canon 34 of the Apostolic Canons, which is expressive of the Church's self-understanding in the early centuries and is held in honor by many, though not all Christians today, the first among the bishops in each nation would only make a decision in agreement with the other bishops, and the latter would make no important decision without the agreement of the first. The understanding of primacy of honor varies greatly within Orthodoxy. The Russian Orthodox Church regards it as purely honorific, while the Patriarchate of Constantinople invokes it to convene councils, grant autocephaly, hear appeals, and so forth. As Brian Daly conclusively shows, the Church of the Councils did not know of a purely honorific type of primacy. When the Third Council of Constantinople in 381, when the third canon, of the Council of Constantinople first introduced primacy of honor, and when the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon reaffirmed it, this time of primacy referred to a jurisdictional authority to make binding decisions, a first rank of leadership, pastoral responsibility, patronage, understood as reviewing and ratifying episcopal elections, ordaining bishops, mediating disputes, and being respected by the bishops who were expected to be loyal, all these in an otherworldly sense and not in the sense in which imperial power was exercised. Later on, 12th century Byzantine writers such as Ioannis Zonaras and Theodore Balsamon presented a primacy that became devoid of real authority and largely ceremonial, referring to the order of liturgical commemorations, listings in synodal documents, the right to wear a Phrygian cap, a chain representing the office, a scepter, and the right to ride a horse. The Russian interpretation of primacy of honor is rooted in this latter interpretation. Rejecting a ceremonial conception of primacy, however, Zizoulas applies the model of the primates of autocephalous churches discussed above to the ecumenical patriarch, whose authority would be real, well beyond the mere primacy of honor, but it should not be confused with universal jurisdiction. Zizoulas writes, "The Patriarch of Constantinople could not interfere in the affairs of the other patriarchates, but would be responsible for the canonical order within them and intervene only when asked to do so in cases of emergency or disturbance and anomaly of some kind. He would also be responsible for the convocation of councils dealing with matters pertaining to the entire Orthodox churches, always with the consent of the other patriarchs." End quote. After the failure of the ecumenical patriarch to ensure the participation of all autocephalous churches at the Council of Crete in 2016, Zizoulas' contention that, as the first in the East, the Patriarch of Constantinople convenes councils pertaining to issues that affect the entire Orthodox world, strikes a tragic note. Without a doubt, a greater level of authority is necessary for an efficient exercise of the universal ministry of unity and of synodality, so dear to Orthodox hearts. It should be possible to exercise a pan-Orthodox form of primacy with real authority, similar to the primacy that national churches experience internally. An Eastern primate should be able to convene synods and set their agendas, speak for the entire Eastern Christianity, ensure that individual bishops follow the church's discipline within their own diocese, hear appeal, and discipline bishops. Perhaps such a model of authority could make possible pan-Orthodox synodality and, if given to the Pope in a united church, even universal synodality. Thank you.